think of when you picture the setting of a Jane Austen novel? For many, it would be country houses in parkland, country cottages in rectories, the kind of settings Jane Austen had in mind when she created Uppercross in Persuasion, a moderate-sized village completely in the Old English style, containing only 2 houses superior in appearance to those of the yeomen and labourers, the mansion of the squire, with its high walls, great gates, and old trees, substantial and unmodernised, and the compact, tight parsonage, enclosed in its own neat garden, with a vine and a pear tree trained round its casements. Given Jane Austen's advice to her niece Anna Lefroy that you will be in danger of giving false impressions if you write about settings and situations you have not experienced, it is unsurprising that Hampshire country girl Jane Austen, daughter of a rector in rural Steventon, who spent the most productive part of her writing life in a cottage in Chawton, should choose the countryside as a major setting for her novels. Today, we will explore how rural life influenced Austen's writings, with special reference to her life and times and her novels Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and Emma. First, we will turn our attention to what life in the countryside was like in the early part of the 19th century. At this time, 4/5 of the population of Britain lived in the countryside, and 1/3 of the population worked in agriculture. Despite this predominantly agricultural society, with strong ties to the land and seasonal rhythms, many changes were afoot in Jane Austen's lifetime, which paved the way for the modern countryside around us today. The Industrial Revolution was beginning to gather pace and wrought change in the countryside as people moved from rural areas into cities and towns to find work. To produce charcoal required for the new industries, iron smelting as at Coalbrookdale, and heating, woods were coppiced and felled, shaping the face of the landscape. Britain was at war for most of Jane's life, first in the American War of Independence, and then with France from 1793 to 1815 during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. This produced enormous demand for food, and the countryside became intensively farmed. Enclosure Acts meant that common land or large fields where the rural poor grazed their animals were turned into smaller fields under the control of landowners. Jane Austen uses the suffering of the rural poor resulting from enclosure as yet another example of John Dashwood's self-centred nature in Sense and Sensibility. Concerned with maintaining his own wealth and prestige to the extent of being ungenerous to his stepmother and half-sisters by evicting them from the family home to live off the charity of a relative in a small cottage following the death of his father, he bemoans that the enclosure of Norland Common now carrying on is a most serious drain on his finances, using the excuse that he has spent all his money enclosing the Norland estate for not financially supporting Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters. He is also villainised for sweeping away country sites of historic beauty, such as the old walnut trees he plans to fell to build a new glass house. Agricultural practices were shifting as farming became mechanised, meaning that less people were needed to work the land, resulting in unemployment and riots. Discontent was fuelled by poor harvests and the perceived injustices of the tithe system, where workers had to give a portion of their ownings or produce to landowners and the church, as referred to in Pride and Prejudice, where selfish clergyman Mr. Collins feels he must make such an arrangement for tithes as may be beneficial to himself. In the 18th century, those who were too ill, old, or who were orphan children were put into a local workhouse. Those able to work, but whose wages were too low to support their families, received relief in the form of money, food and clothes. By the end of the 1790s, there were clear signs that the poor relief system was under severe strain. Increasing numbers of parish poor were seeking assistance, and the cost to ratepayers of maintaining the system was rocketing. Charitable people like Emma Woodhouse and Anne Elliot in Jane Austen's novels are depicted carrying baskets of food to the less fortunate. Towards the end of Jane Austen's life, in 1816, often called the year without a summer, the volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora caused global climate disruption, resulting in agricultural hardship due to unusually cold and wet weather. Due to the poor wheat harvest, the price of bread soared, and riots over food sometimes erupted. However, many of the bleaker changes in the British countryside are overlooked in Jane Austen's novels of comedic social comedy, which focus on the more cultured world of the gentry and how they viewed and utilised the countryside. Alongside the Industrial Revolution, there was a revolution in how people perceived the countryside around them. Landscape gardener Humphrey Repton and others developed a picturesque theory that influenced Regency people to view the countryside as though it was a painting to be analysed. They classified countryside sites into the beautiful, the picturesque, and the sublime. As the Napoleonic Wars prevented British aristocrats from travelling to enjoy the scenery of Europe on a grand tour, many visited the British countryside to educate themselves in good taste by applying picturesque theory to the landscapes they encountered. As we see in Northanger Abbey, when naive heroine Catherine Morland attempts to emulate her cultured friends the Tilneys and admires the countryside near Bath. The Tilneys were viewing the country with eyes of persons accustomed to drawing, and decided on its capability of being formed into pictures with all the eagerness of real taste. Here, Catherine was quite lost. However, Catherine was so hopeful a scholar that when they gained the top of Beeching Cliff, she voluntarily rejected the whole city of Bath as unworthy to make part of the landscape. As well as admiring the landscape, those with gardens developed these to display their sophistication, wealth and cultural sensibilities. Previously fashionable formal French garden designs were rejected in favour of a naturalistic, harmonious compositions of lawns, ornamental gardens, woodlands and buildings like follies, which blended seamlessly in a natural way, as they do in the wilderness mentioned in Mansfield Park. Some estates had pastoral designs with sweeping vistas and expansive lawns by Capability Brown, seen in places like Chatsworth or Blenheim Palace. Others favoured the designs of Humphrey Repton, with eye-catching buildings in vistas, dramatic artificial ruins and wildernesses, making landscapes look like perfectly framed pictures. Repton advertised his designs in red books showing before and after images of the grounds of Stoneleigh Abbey, home of Jane Austen's maternal relatives, and they had grounds designed by Repton. Conservatories and glasshouses grew in importance as exemplars of architectural beauty, expressing the social status of the owner, allowing them to grow fruit and flowers out of season, and being social spaces for taking tea and admiring botanical specimens. Pineapples required meticulous attention, and the fruit itself took months to ripen. Speaking of his pineapple-growing hothouse at Northanger Abbey, General Tilney boasts in self-depreciating yet exaggerated fashion that his pinery had yielded only 100 in the last year. Kitchen gardens, often walled gardens, provided fruit, vegetables, herbs and flowers for use in the home. Exchanging posies with florography meanings was a mode of subtle communication for those with romantic sensibilities. In Mansfield Park, Lady Bertram mentions how the novel's heroine, Fanny Price, has been gathering roses for posies and other household uses, such as making rose water, soap and potpourri. I sat 3/4 of an hour in the flower garden while Fanny cut the roses, and very pleasant it was, I assure you, but very hot. It was shady enough in the alcove, but I declare I quite dreaded the coming home again. Jane Austen was born on the 16th of December 1775, the daughter of George and Cassandra Austen, and she had 6 brothers and 1 sister. She was especially close to her sister Cassandra, who was 2 years older than her. Jane grew up in the rectory in the village of Steventon, where her father was the rector for the local Anglican parishes. The rector's family were the hub of the social community which provided Jane with material for her witty social commentary. Jane's father also ran a school to prepare the sons of the local gentry for university from the Steventon rectory. Jane's niece, Anna Lefroy, remembered her aunt as a lover of the outdoors and natural scenery. Her letters are filled with descriptions of walks in all kinds of weather, and her novels contain numerous scenes that take place not in a drawing room, but on a tree-lined path or windswept hill. Altogether, Jane spent 3/4 of her life in the Hampshire countryside. It was certainly the place where she felt most at home. As she writes in Emma, there is nothing like staying at home for real comfort. In Jane Austen's novels, we get a sense of the characters going about their lives against a picturesque natural backdrop, the likes of which Jane herself must have known growing up in Steventon. Her nephew later wrote that it was the cradle of her genius. When Jane wrote about her fictional country towns of Highbury or Meryton, she could equally have been writing about the village of Steventon. Steventon Rectory, surrounded by meadows, had a walled garden with a sundial, espaliered fruit trees, vegetable and flower beds, and grassy walks. The garden was largely tended by Jane's mother, although, like the rectory, it sadly vanished when the home was demolished in the 1820s. In addition to his clerical and teaching duties, Mr. Austen leased 200 acres of farmland, called Cheesedown Farm, from his cousins in Kent and managed this. As well as arable crops, pigs and sheep were kept, and letters mention Mrs. Austen curing ham from the pigs in order to preserve it. Mrs. Austen also kept 5 Alderney dairy cows, a now extinct breed of cattle, and oversaw the poultry house, as rector's wife Charlotte Collins does in Pride and Prejudice. Other areas of the rectory that Mrs. Austen managed were the brew house, beehives, and kitchen garden that offered both culinary and medicinal plants. A quaint, jumbled-up blend of edible and ornamental plants, the kitchen garden was as much her delight as the flower borders, remembered Mrs. Austen's granddaughter Anna. Mrs. Austen dug up potatoes wearing a green, round frock like a day labourer's. Eventually, Jane and Cassandra would inherit their mother's enthusiasm for gardening. With their small farm, the Austens were fairly self-sufficient, although they had to buy in lemons, spices, and fashionable but expensive drinks like tea and coffee. Any time remaining to Jane after helping to run the family home and farm was spent writing, playing the pianoforte, sewing, attending church, visiting neighbours, and dancing in assemblies. At one of these dances, Jane began a flirtation with Tom Lefroy, an Irish relative of Jane's friend, Mrs. Anna Lefroy. Mrs. Anne Lefroy lived at Ash Rectory, which is situated in a village near Steventon, and to which Jane took country walks to call upon her friends, as Jane Bennet does in Pride and Prejudice. Tom Lefroy was taking a break from his law studies in London when he met Jane. However, there is no evidence that he ever proposed to her, and their relationship ended as he returned to London to complete his studies. Perhaps the social and economic obstacles to romance inspired Jane Austen to write First Impressions, which she completed in 1797, a novel which she later reworked as Pride and Prejudice. Jane Austen was to live for the first 25 years of her life at Steventon before her father gave up the living at Steventon to his son James and retired to the city of Bath, where he later died, leaving his wife and 2 unmarried daughters to rely on the kindness of their brothers to find a home. After living in towns like Bath and Portsmouth, it was a relief for country-loving Jane when she, her mother and sister Cassandra were offered a cottage on the country estate of their brother, Edward Knight, in 1809. Edward had been adopted by the wealthy Knight family at the age of 12. The Knights were distant relatives of the Austens, and upon his adoption, Edward took their surname and was brought up as a wealthy gentleman. Perhaps Jane missed her brother when he was adopted, as she later wrote in Emma about Frank Weston's strikingly similar adoption by his wealthy relatives, the Churchills, that there is something so shocking in a child being taken away from his parents and natural home. Jane enjoyed the luxury of staying with Edward at his mansions at Chawton House and Godmersham in Kent, with its gardens and parkland landscaped by Capability Brown. And in 1808 she wrote to Cassandra that I shall eat ice and drink French wine and be above vulgar economy at Godmersham, temporarily indulging in finer things, free from the financial cares she usually dealt with. Another benefit of Godmersham was its library, where Jane rejoiced in 1813 at finding a volume of poems by her favourite poet Cowper, and loved being alone in the library, mistress of all I survey. At least I may say so, and repeat the whole poem if I like, without offence to anybody. Jane Austen spent a cumulative total of 10 months staying in these luxurious surroundings. When Edward lost his wife, he offered his mother and sisters the cottage at Chawton, which is now the Jane Austen House Museum. This unassuming 17th century red brick house delighted Jane Austen, and she wrote happily to her brother Frank, expressing her excitement in verse. Our Chawton house, how much we find already in it to our mind, and how convinced that when complete it will all other houses beat that ever have been made or mended with rooms concise or rooms distended. The verse brings to mind all the delight and relief felt by the Dashwood ladies in Sense and Sensibility at having a home of their own. It is easy to imagine Jane and Cassandra endeavouring, by placing around them their books and other possessions, to form themselves a home, just like Marianne and Elinor Dashwood. Jane Austen's wit thrived in the society of the local families, and she advised her aspiring author niece Anna in a letter dated September the 9th, 1814, that 3 or 4 families in a country village is the very thing to work on. Every morning after breakfast, Jane would remain behind in the dining parlour and work on her novels at the little table near the window, where she could watch the occasional passer-by and notice the arrival of visitors. Since she did not have a separate study to work in, she was often interrupted mid-flow and relied on the squeaking of the door hinges to warn her when someone entered. She would then hide her work under the blotter. However, her sister Cassandra was allowed to hear her latest work, and Jane Austen's niece Marianne remembered hearing peals of laughter through the door as Jane read her writing out to Cassandra. Chawton Cottage harked back to Steventon Rectory, as it had a country garden with lawns, flower beds, an orchard, a shrubbery walk, and a large vegetable patch. Letters mention flowers like primroses, hyacinths, anemones and violets growing in the garden. Mrs. Austen busied herself with growing fruit, vegetables and herbs, and the Austen ladies enjoyed peas, strawberries, gooseberries, red currants and black currants from the kitchen garden, plus honey from the beehives. Family friend and avid cook Martha Lloyd lived with the Austen women and used ingredients from the Chawton Cottage garden in her recipes. Martha's household book contains a collection of recipes and medicinal remedies, which included ingredients sourced from the garden. Jane's sister Cassandra enjoyed helping her mother with the gardening, not always successfully. In May 1811, Jane warned her, "I will not say that your mulberry trees are dead, but I am afraid they are not alive." In his A Memoir of Jane Austen, Jane's nephew, James Edward Austen Leigh, describes the Chawton Cottage garden thus: "A high wooden fence and hornbeam hedge shut out the Winchester Road, which skirted the whole length of the little domain. Trees were planted each side to form a shrubbery walk, carried round the enclosure, which gave sufficient space for ladies' exercise. There was a pleasant, irregular mixture of hedgerow and gravel walk and orchard, and long grass for mowing, arising from 2 or 3 little enclosures having been thrown together. Many of Jane's letters and novels reference gardens, suggesting that she enjoyed spending time outdoors. Away from the hustle and bustle of town and settled in rural tranquillity, Jane returned to her writing after a break of several years. Her creativity flourished, and during the next few years she revised Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility and Northanger Abbey, and wrote Mansfield Park, Emma and Persuasion. Jane's sister Cassandra assisted this increase in productivity as she took responsibility for the day-to-day running of the household at Chawton, and, as she once admitted during one of Cassandra's absences, Jane found composition impossible with my head full of joints of mutton and doses and rhubarb. It was whilst living at Chawton that Jane started to anonymously publish her writing. Between 1811 and 1816, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park and Emma were published. Pride and Prejudice is perhaps Jane Austen's most famous work. The novel tells the story of Elizabeth Bennet and how she overcomes her character flaw of prejudice against proud Mr. Darcy to achieve a happy marriage. Along the path she takes to come to love Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth navigates the complexities of social norms, morality, individuality, economics and romance, as she helps her older sister Jane, as she is thwarted in her love for Mr. Darcy's friend Mr. Bingley, and has her family's reputation threatened when her youngest sister Lydia runs away with dashing but deceitful soldier Mr. Wickham. Heroine Elizabeth Bennet is frequently seen taking country walks and taking in the scenery of her home county of Hertfordshire and country house parklands in Derbyshire and Kent. She appreciates being outdoors, especially in fine weather, delighting that every day was adding to the verdure of the early trees. When she hears that her sister Jane has fallen ill when visiting Netherfield Park, she thinks nothing of walking in bad weather to tend her, although her readiness to walk and weather-beaten appearance are scorned by snobbish Caroline Bingley, who much prefers the comforts of the town. To walk 3 miles, or 4 miles, or 5 miles, or whatever it is, above her ankles in dirt, and alone, quite alone. What could she mean by it? It seems to me to shew an abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country town indifference to decorum. However, Elizabeth Bennet soon defends her enjoyment of social observations within her countryside home. Overall, the exchange advocates for a balanced perspective, seeing the merits of both country and town. The country, said Darcy, can in general supply but a few subjects for such a study. In a country neighbourhood, you move in a very confined and unvarying society. Elizabeth replied, but people themselves alter so much that there is something new to be observed in them forever. Yes, indeed, cried Mrs. Bennet, offended by his manner of mentioning a country neighbourhood. I assure you there is quite as much of that going on in the countryside as in town. Everybody was surprised, and Darcy, after looking at her for a moment, turned silently away. Mrs. Bennet, who fancied she had gained a complete victory over him, continued her triumph. I cannot see that London has any great advantage over the country, for my part, except the shops and public places. The country is a vast deal pleasanter, is it not, Mr. Bingley? When I am in the country, he replied, I never wish to leave it, and when I am in the town, it is pretty much the same. They have each their advantages, and I can be equally happy in either. Ay, that is because you have the right disposition. But that gentleman, looking at Mr. Darcy, seemed to think the country was nothing at all. Indeed, mamma, you are mistaken, said Elizabeth, blushing for her mother. You quite mistook Mr. Darcy. He only meant that there was not such a variety of people to be met with in the country as in the town, which you must acknowledge to be true. The attitude of other characters to the outdoors reveals much about them. Obsequious Mr. Collins is almost as proud of the grounds around his parsonage as he is of their proximity to Rosings Park, home of his haughty patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, feeling that, of all the views of which his garden, or which the country or kingdom could boast, none were to be compared with the prospect of Rosings afforded by an opening in the trees that bordered the park nearly opposite the front of his house. Mr. Collins is eager to show the view off to visitors, but fortunately the cold weather provides an excuse. Mr. Collins would have led them round his 2 meadows, but the ladies, not having shoes to encounter the remains of a white frost, turned back. However, half boots were available for ladies seeking a robust type of footwear for country walks. These combined leather and a hard-wearing textile like nankeen cotton. Often nails were hammered through the soles to offer grip on stony or icy paths. For wet and muddy conditions, patterns could be fitted over the shoes. These were composed of a wooden sole mounted on an iron ring that raised the wearer's feet off the ground. Mr. Collins' wife, Charlotte, wisely gets him out of her way by encouraging him to spend much of his time in the garden. After learning of Mr. Darcy's involvement in separating her sister Jane from Mr. Bingley, and the surprise of Darcy's proposal to her, Elizabeth is keen to take a tour of the countryside, to forget about the trials of romance, exclaiming, "What are young men to rocks and mountains?" However, the proposed tour of the Lake District is curtailed, and Elizabeth instead finds herself in Derbyshire. There is not a finer county in England than Derbyshire, Jane Austen declares in Pride and Prejudice, and the Peak District's idyllic stone buildings, verdant valleys, deep caverns, towering gritstone edges and windswept moorlands make it a setting romanticised in contemporary journals about the picturesque. Settings such as Lyme Park, Stanage Edge and Chatsworth House have been used for film adaptations, and some think it possible that Jane Austen visited Derbyshire in 1811, staying at the Rutland Arms in Bakewell, where she revised the final chapters of Pride and Prejudice, using Bakewell as the inspiration for the village of Lambton in the novel. She may even have visited Chatsworth, which is famed throughout Britain at the time. The beautiful surroundings of Mr. Darcy's home in Pemberley make Elizabeth Bennet begin to regret refusing his offer of marriage when she visits. The eye was instantly caught by Pemberley House, situated on the opposite side of a valley, into which the road with some abruptness wound. It was a large, handsome stone building, standing well on rising ground, and backed by a ridge of high, woody hills, and in front, a stream of some natural importance was swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance. Its banks were neither formal nor falsely adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. They were all of them warm in their admiration, and at that moment she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be something. Unfortunately for fans of the 1995 adaptation, where Colin Firth's Mr. Darcy appears before Elizabeth in a soaked shirt after swimming in a lake on the Pemberley estate, in the novel he takes her by surprise by riding to the estate a day before he was expected. After visiting Pemberley, Elizabeth admits to Jane that her feelings for Mr. Darcy developed after seeing his estate, stating, "I believe I must date it from my first seeing his beautiful grounds at Pemberley." This quote shows how the countryside around Pemberley changed Elizabeth's perceptions, as the estate's natural beauty, elegance and elevated position mirror Mr. Darcy's character, as he needs no artifice in order to be an impressive person. The estate is well managed, and both the tenants and servants speak well of Darcy, showing his true caring nature. The countryside in Pride and Prejudice is more than just a setting. It's a force that shapes the characters' perceptions, influences their relationships, and provides a backdrop for the unfolding social drama. In Sense and Sensibility, sisters Marianne and Eleanor Dashwood find true love and happiness in spite of obstacles. Forced to leave their cherished home of Norland Park after the death of their father, they take up the offer of a humble residence at Barton Cottage on a relative's estate. One of the charms of the novel comes from the contrasting characters of sensible Eleanor and her younger sister Marianne, who imagines herself as a heroine of one of the novels of sensibility popular at the time. The idea of sensibility involved people showing a keen sensitivity as regards emotions, appreciation of art and natural surroundings, something exemplified by Marianne. After many mishaps and a failed romance with the dashing but irresponsible Mr. Willoughby, whom she meets when he comes to her rescue when she sprains her ankle running down a hillside in the rain, Marianne comes to adopt a more realistic approach to life. The early parts of Sense and Sensibility are largely set in the countryside, and Marianne Dashwood has an attachment to the scenery influenced by her love of reading romantic texts which viewed nature as a powerful, awe-inspiring force and a source of profound emotional and spiritual experience. Jane Austen satirises the impractical excesses of the romantic movement. For example, when Mrs. Dashwood considers altering her new home at Barton Cottage, Marianne's beau, Mr. Willoughby, another fanatic of romanticism, disapproves of the idea of renovating the quaint but uncomfortable cottage. On Mrs. Dashwood's happening to mention her design of improving the cottage in the spring, he warmly opposed every alteration of a place which affection had established as perfect to him. Cottages had undergone an improvement in reputation at the time, from hovel to fashionable residence, following the popularisation of the shepherdess style by French Queen Marie Antoinette, and some have pointed out that the cottage in Sense and Sensibility has similarities with Chawton Cottage. Austen compares the Dashwood cottage to ideals of a cottage residence thus: as a house, Barton Cottage, though all was comfortable and compact, but as a cottage it was defective, for the building was irregular, the roof tiled, the window shutters were not painted green, nor were the walls covered with honeysuckles. Finally, Marianne finds herself in a more picturesque and elite residence after marrying Colonel Brandon, who has a walled garden covered with the best fruit trees in the country. The heroine of Emma is a lovable, privileged and confident busybody and matchmaker whose errors get her into trouble and almost ruin the happiness of her friend Harriet Smith and herself as she neglects her own emotional needs. Fortunately, Emma learns the error of her ways with the help of her old friend Mr. George Knightley, whom she eventually marries, and both she and Harriet have happy endings. Farming is a topic of the novel, not least because Harriet Smith eventually follows her own inclination and marries farmer Robert Martin, despite Emma's interference trying to secure her a wealthier match, but because farming is also a source of wealth for landowner Mr. George Knightley. The two Knightley brothers, John and George, discuss improvements to George Knightley's estate due to take place in spring, when the better weather meant alterations were desirable in preparation for the increasing harvest. The plan of a drain, the change of a fence, the felling of a tree, and the destination of every acre of wheat, turnips or spring corn was entered into with as much equality of interest by John as his cooler manners rendered possible. The Knightleys are Mr. Knightley is not only astute in improving the productivity of his estate, but he is kind in sharing its bounty and gives apples from his orchard to poorer members of the community, like Mrs. and Miss Bates and Jane Fairfax. The countryside is also a place for recreation and exploring the surroundings during walks or carriage excursions is mentioned taking place in many households, even that of fashionable and snobbish Mrs. Elton. My brother and sister have promised us a visit in the spring or summer at farthest, continued Mrs. Elton, and that will be our time for exploring. Whilst they are with us, we shall explore a great deal, I dare say. When people come into a beautiful country of this sort, you know, Miss Woodhouse, one naturally wishes them to see as much as possible. The barouche landau was a luxurious, open-topped, four-wheeled carriage, driven as an elite pastime. Mrs. Elton's repeated mentions of the carriage, to attempt to make herself sound superior, are not surprisingly nauseating to her listeners. One place which Mrs. Elton is eager to explore is Mr. Knightley's home of Donwell Abbey, as Donwell was famous for its strawberry beds, which seemed a plea for the invitation. But no plea was necessary. Cabbage beds would have been enough to tempt the lady, who only wanted to be going somewhere. Donwell becomes the setting for a famous strawberry picnic in Emma, where she learns a lesson after Mr. Knightley tells her that her ungracious teasing of poor Miss Bates was badly done. The countryside is also the source of more innocent and instinctive enjoyment in Emma, and there is a lovely glimpse of how the sunny weather and emergence of spring flowers can impact on the well-being of those enjoying them. When she looked at the hedges, she thought the elder, at least, must soon be coming out, and when she turned to Harriet, she saw something like a look of spring, a tender smile even there. Reading Jane Austen's depictions of the countryside reinforces our connection to nature in an uplifting way, and I hope that my talk has given you an appreciation of how the natural world inspired Jane Austen to consider next time you read one of her novels or watch an adaptation of one of her stories. Thank you for listening.